Welcome, everybody. Good morning for those of you who are joining. Welcome, who are on our live Eddie Chavez Calderon here with Uriel Aesthetics. So excited to have our friends here from the UFW Foundation. I'm so excited to be here with Diana Tellefson Torres, who is a founding executive director of the UFW Foundation United Farm Workers, an organization that mobilizes farm workers across the United States to advocate for more equitable policies, from immigration reform to worker protections like heat standards, overtime pay, and pesticide protections. My friends, I want to let everybody know how excited we are to have Diana. Uriel Aesthetic has had a campaign of over 300 plus rabbis who are demanding for heat protection for our immigrant workers all across the nation because of the increase of worker violations in our country. So we're super excited to have you, Diana. Thank you so much for being a part of this today.
Thank you, Eddie. It's a pleasure to be here and appreciate all of the support you all have provided over the years.
Thank you so much, Diana. So tell us a little bit, Diana, what are the attacks happening right now on our farm worker community?
Where do I begin? It's certainly been a challenge this year. We have farm workers who, as you know, work day in and day out, work throughout the pandemic, and are workers who are often the most underpaid, working in isolated regions of the country. And so it just so happens that this year we have had a number of attempts to have farm worker wages lowered. And basically in agriculture, we have the H-2A guest worker program. So there are farm workers who come in from Mexico, from different parts of the country, sometimes Jamaica, Haiti, et cetera. And the H-2A guest worker program really entails the growers or the employer request for workers to come into the country. The workers are supposed to be provided with housing. They're supposed to be provided with a specific amount of pay. And so this is called the adverse effect wage rate, right? So some of the protections that we've won at the national level are that farm workers in the guest worker program are paid this adverse effect wage rate to ensure that there isn't an impact, an adverse effect on domestic farm workers who are here in the country. So there are attempts by grower associations and growers all over the country to reduce what those workers are being paid. And these are very low paid workers as it is. There's an increase maybe of $1 or less than $1 for H-2A workers in 2023 in different states. And so some legislation was introduced in Georgia, for instance. We have Senator Ossoff, who is a Democrat who partnered with Senator Tillis. And Senator Tillis is a Republican who has not been good on immigration reform issues. And unfortunately, Senator Ossoff introduced a bill with Senator Tillis to reduce the wages of H-2A guest workers. That in turn also impacts domestic workers. And the same thing has happened with 3 Democrats in Michigan who have now introduced the companion bill on the House side. And so, unfortunately, this type of legislation, given the makeup of the Congress and the fact that any legislation introduced this year can also move on to next year, there will be attempts, we know, through appropriations or through must-pass bills, where growers may try to insert this type of language that would really impact farm workers. And in addition, there's attempts for farm workers in the H-2A guest worker program to also have housing or just to diminish the type of protections that they have, and increasing, for instance, the H-2A program to year-round work. And right now it's just seasonal work that can be provided to an H-2A worker. Most year-round work goes to farm workers who are already living in this country or domestic workers. And so this is something that, in the context of not having immigration reform, we were so close to getting the Farm Workforce Modernization Act passed through the last Congress that would provide farm workers throughout the country with the opportunity to gain legal status with a path to citizenship. That was derailed. The American Farm Bureau played a large role in the derailment of that bill. And so we really are looking to supporters to make sure that, folks who are in Congress are hearing directly from constituents on the ground, that Senator Ossoff is hearing from constituents on the ground about the fact that this is really not the way to go. We can't unilaterally reduce the protections of guest workers during a time of high inflation, during a time when farm workers put their lives on the line to work in the pandemic and feed this nation and the world. And so it doesn't make any sense to me that this is something that would happen. But the fact is that growers often see the ceiling of farm worker wages needing to be below $15 an hour, or below an amount that doesn't help sustain a farm worker and their families. And so it's not something that surprises me. Just in the context that farm workers have always been excluded from so many protections at the federal level for so long.
Definitely. And speaking of Michigan, we were following along the issue with the blueberry farmers in Michigan, who was uncovered to have severe mistreatments of workers. We were seeing that they were working 12 hours a day without a break, 30 people living in a 3-bedroom house. How are our UFW Foundation and the rest of the migrant movement working towards stopping these type of policies continuing to happen within farm workers across the nation? We're seeing a lot of these rising attacks.
Yes, well, we certainly have known that there's a lot of abuse in the H-2A guest worker program. There are farm workers who, as you mentioned, are working very long hours beyond the written contract or verbal contract that has been provided to them. So you mentioned the workers from Michigan. We were investigating a case in Georgia where a young man, Miguel Angel Guzman Chavez, died at the age of 24. He was only had a handful of days that he was working in agriculture in South Georgia. He was a guest worker from Mexico, and he ended up dying from heat exhaustion in the summertime a handful of years ago. And as we were investigating this case, we were able to find where he was living, barrack-style housing, no air conditioning, very warm inside, hotter inside than outside. And the workers were eating cup of noodle soup and drinking Pedialyte as their meal, and telling our organizer that they'd been working 16-hour days. So 16-hour days in the midst of Georgia heat in the summer, and not having very much nutrition, your body doesn't recuperate from the heat at night because it's so hot inside. You're not sleeping well. Someone who's just arrived to work in agriculture isn't acclimated to the heat. And so we're seeing these issues over and over again around the country, in addition to the types of labor trafficking issues, right? So many employers that don't follow the law, that are basically letting the workers know that if they don't do what they're told, they won't be asked back. And so workers will try to withstand these horrible conditions, living conditions that no one should be living in. You described what happened in Michigan, where workers are living in incredibly tight quarters, We're seeing that in different parts of the country, and hearing from workers when we have buzzwords that we hear, like when we're on the ground and a worker says, "I'm trying to figure out how to escape." This is not a good situation. Workers are often being held in locations where it's fenced up, where they're being told they're not allowed to talk to anybody outside of those who are living with them in their quarters. And so these are situations that are rampant with abuse. And so a lot of the work that we do in the farm worker movement through the UFW Foundation is to ensure that consumers such as yourselves are aware of what's happening on the ground. There's such a lack of transparency in agriculture because workers, the vast majority are immigrant workers. Many are undocumented, living and working in isolated rural regions of the country. And so you really find situations where there is not a lot of information that gets to consumers or to retailers about what the reality on the ground is. And so when we're speaking about these types of conditions, we want to ensure that we're uplifting the voices of workers themselves, that policymakers, that consumers are hearing directly from farm workers. And so we've really been doing a lot of advocacy at the national level and with the Biden administration to ensure that the rules and the regulations that H-2A employers have to follow are changed. And so, in fact, I believe the Biden administration may have announced what some of those H-2A regulation changes are being proposed today. And so there's going to be a comment period where we will be finding out very soon how long that comment period will be. But the reality is that whether it's from the regulatory process or from a legislative process, the enforcement is also really important. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that there's a lack of investigators on the ground, that most farm workers will let you know, like, I haven't seen someone come investigate or check to see how things are going on the ground or ask me any questions at any point in my career. You really see that there's just a lack of infrastructure in this country that protects workers on the ground. And so we've been looking at beyond the work, regulatory work, the advocacy work. What are the ways that we can connect with workers on the ground? It's very challenging to have physical infrastructure and organizers everywhere in a rural country here. And so we're really developing digital infrastructure and a digital platform where farm workers can connect with us around the country. And so that's something that we've been working on the last 4 to 5 years, where we know that farm workers are very isolated, but more and more farm workers have cell phones. And so how is it that we can connect with farm workers digitally, where we're not able to be physically, so that they understand what their rights are? How can we communicate with them to ensure that they know that there is somewhere to go if they're in a situation that's a bad situation, such as what you described, Eddie?
Thank you. And one of our hubs is here in Arizona, where we're surrounded by farm workers, and we have an amazing partnership with our local UFW. But we've noticed an excessive heat that we went through here in Arizona with I think we surpassed 100 days of 100 plus weather. We're now well into September, and it's still 100 plus weather outside, extremely extreme heat. And yet we're still puzzled that there is still no federal heat protection. And as we understand that climate change is continuing to raise the temperature in our communities, what is UFW Foundation and UFW collectively doing to advocate for heat protection policies on a federal level?
Well, certainly, this is an issue that that the farm worker movement's been working on for quite a while. As you may know, in California in 2005, we were able to win heat standards in this state, but it took work. Like we were communicating with the families of farm workers who had passed away from heat exhaustion that year and in previous years. And we had been trying for many years to try to get heat standards. And when we say heat standards, let me just say it's something incredibly basic, that workers should have shade, something as basic as shade, that they should have accessible, cool, clean water, and that they have paid rest breaks when they are, as soon as they're needed. Every person's body is different. And so if a worker feels that they need to take a break to really, just get a little bit of rest, that like those are the most basic of things, trainings, what to do if you're feeling symptoms, to make sure that managers are being trained and that they know what to do. What is the emergency plan? These are not like, this isn't rocket science. This is like basic stuff that we believe should be followed and mandated at every workplace in the nation, and in particular for outdoor workers. They are in particular danger as the climate keeps changing. And so we have been really looking at how do we take what we've won in California and have continued to try to make California standards better, and especially with the enforcement piece. As I mentioned, the laws on the books aren't always the laws in the fields. And so making sure that there is that investigators are on the ground, that there are organizations such as ours that can be intermediaries to speak on behalf of workers who are reporting abuses or any type of situation to us, so we can then report that to CalOSHA, for instance. These are all things that can be done in other states and throughout the country. And so we've been, given the situation that we're seeing in particular this summer, we really want emergency regulations at the federal level to happen. Now, we've been told in years past that it takes at least about 7 years to get regulations through at the federal level. Well, farm workers keep dying. Outdoor workers, are so vulnerable to the heat. And so uplifting the stories of what's happening on the ground is certainly something that we're doing, making sure that farm workers and supporters such as yourselves are communicating with the Biden administration is important, that they understand what is at stake, that lives are at stake. And you mentioned Arizona, Eddie. I was just recently this summer in Yuma County. And as you know, Yuma can get incredibly hot, and it's also a very agricultural area there in Arizona. And we have organizers there on the UFW Foundation's side. They're doing some work on the ground. And we found out that a farm worker of 25 years of age, Dario Mendoza, died from heat exhaustion. He was working in melon fields and perished. And so we attended the funeral, and Dario's face looked incredibly dark. He had clearly been impacted by the sun. He had only been working for a handful of days, and that, very weak, he had told his girlfriend that they were not providing them with water, that they were not providing them with shade, that he and the guys that were going into work with him would have to stop by the Circle K in the morning to try to get water and ice for themselves. Now, if you're working in agriculture, and at that time, that week, it was 118 degrees at the peak of the day that Dario died, water will become hot very quickly. And so, water has to be replenished with ice, keeping it cool. And that's usually the foreman's job, or whoever it is that's assigned that job. That's also in management. And so the fact that a young man who had two young children passed away from heat exhaustion in Yuma County just doesn't make any sense. It could have been preventable. His death could have been avoided. And so the fact that we went to a church full of family members and friends who lost a young one, and who lost a young father who has two little ones. His daughter had her first day of kindergarten the day that they held this funeral, is just incredibly unnecessary and so incredibly sad. And I must just say that was the first time that I'd attended a funeral of a farm worker who passed away from heat exhaustion. I've been working on advocacy for 19 years now with a farm worker movement, and the impact of seeing Darius's hands that had been covered with flowers because his family thought his hands just looked incredibly burned, and they didn't want folks to see his hands, but they were leathery, they were very dark, they looked like the hands of someone who might have been in their 90s, just really very challenging to see the pictures of this young man, with families and friends, and then seeing him lifeless. And it was just impactful for me, and just really drives us to do the work that we do, because we know that these basic things aren't being done often. And so in particular, it took some years to really start to see shade going up in California, right? We had to really work on the ground to ensure that farm workers understood what their rights were. And that's work that's continuous, but at the national level, we're seeing the death of a farm worker now recently in North Carolina, Dario's death in Arizona. We have been investigating 2 cases of farm worker deaths here in California, where we do have heat protection, but we need more substantial enforcement. And so Elidio Hernandez, of 59 years of age, who was working in tomatillo fields near Fresno, just recently passed away. So these are definitely stories that policymakers need to hear, that the Biden administration needs to hear, and that consumers need to hear, because I think all of us really uplifting these stories and being active and letting congressional members, government agencies understand that lives are at stake is incredibly important.
Now, while we look at all of these awful things and we think about policy going forth, I'm really interested in the fact of enforcement. And I know you hinted at this, but how do our folks who see clear violations and hear from people saying, help me, where do they go to? How can they support people? How do we keep folks in check? How do we really start to look at enforcement? Because I agree with you. Oftentimes, there just isn't enforcement happening.
Yeah, more often than not. Yeah, it's been a reality for a long time. And I would say, one of the good things that we've been able to demonstrate now, I mentioned that in California, we won in 2005 a heat regulation, but we also had to sue Cal OSHA later on because of the lack of enforcement of the law. And when we settled, we determined through an MOU with Cal OSHA that the UFW Foundation, the UFW, could essentially be an intermediary on the ground, that farm workers could report something to us. When you're talking about farm workers, many of whom are immigrant, indigenous workers who sometimes speak their indigenous language more so than English or Spanish maybe, and who are often undocumented, going to a government agency is incredibly intimidating. knowing which agency to go to is sometimes not something that workers are aware of, or they're just intimidated or scared to report something. And so that structure was very helpful because workers knew that they could connect with us and that we could anonymously report. We didn't have to give their name. We could report what was happening in which farm, where the workers were located, so that an investigator could go out. And often we were the ones who were walking through an investigator of how to get to that field, because investigators would often get lost. And so I would say that kind of structure has been helpful. And I think that's infrastructure that should be considered throughout the nation. What are organizations on the ground or having intermediaries that understand the farm worker community, that are working with the farm worker community on the ground or digitally, that can then be intermediaries with the government agencies, is something that we believe is something that can be done now. Folks who are not farm workers are often calling us to report things that they're seeing as well. So I would encourage that. That's something that we follow up on to try to see what information we can find out, which agency is involved. We're not just talking about issues surrounding heat, but like wage theft, sexual abuse, you name it, it happens on the ground. And so these are all things that ensuring that farm workers understand where they can call, what is accessible to them, so that something can be done is important. But it also takes just a lot of inoculation, right? There's tremendous fear of losing your job. And so when workers are living paycheck to paycheck, sometimes they endure that type of abuse because they're afraid that they're not going to have the opportunity to work, just work generally, to be able to pay for rent or for childcare for their child, et cetera. And so these are all systemic issues that we need to address very broadly. And I would say from a policy perspective, I think looking at the context of agriculture historically, right? We have in the 1930s, farm workers were excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act. It was Dixiecrats in the South who had said that they would only vote for the Fair Labor Standards Act if workers who were Black were excluded. And that was workers who were in either the agriculture industry, who were farm workers, or who were domestic workers, where those just tend to be like Black workers at the time in the South. And so we're talking about Jim Crow era laws that still exist today. Farm workers were excluded from collective bargaining, meaning that around the country, they're not allowed to unionize, or they can unionize, but there isn't an infrastructure or a system in place to help them. And so we only have a few states in the country where farm workers have the right to unionize at the state level. New York is one of them. California was the first. And so we have a lot to do here in this country because in addition to not having the right to unionize, workers are excluded from overtime and other protections. So when we're hearing about workers working 12-hour days, 16-hour days, 10-hour days, 6 days a week, 7 days a week, they're not getting overtime. In fact, there's some rampant wage theft. And so sometimes they're not even making the minimum wage. And so a lot of the times when a worker will get hurt, there's no workers' compensation in many states. And so that's another thing that workers have been excluded from. So there is a lot of work to be done to ensure that we're building the power and the pressure on the ground so that congressional members understand the responsibility at hand to ensure that our food system, when we're talking about sustainability, it's not just like, will we be able to grow food in the future? Are our crops, pesticide free? We're talking also about the workforce. Is the workforce healthy? Is the workforce and the workers that are working in our food industry being treated justly? And, the type of exposure to pesticides, it's not just about the plants or consumers, it's also about the workers who are applying that pesticide, who are taking it home when it's on their clothes. And so these are issues that may seem overwhelming. But as someone who's been working for almost 2 decades in the farm worker movement, as I mentioned, like technology is playing a huge role, right? Like farm workers are now taking video of employers who are being abusive or who are yelling at them. They are now able to connect via their cell phones if there's some type of emergency. And so ensuring that information is in their hands is super important, and ensuring that H-2A workers who are coming outside of the country into the US have that information before they come is incredibly important as well. But we really do believe that enforcement lies in the hands of the workers. They're the best enforcers of the law. And so if they have a union contract, that union contract and that collective unity with other workers helps them enforce any state or federal law that exists, and it helps them enforce the contract that they have with their employer. And in addition to that, farm workers having an opportunity to report abuses in a way that keeps them anonymous, having intermediaries like that is also a way to protect workers. So there's a lot that needs to be done to ensure that there is more money that's being appropriated for enforcement, for investigators who are actually going out into the fields, right? Like they're investigators, and mostly they don't focus on agriculture most of the time. They will be sent to office buildings, to places where workers aren't constantly mobile or moving. And so that there's work to be done, that I think that we continue to make progress. But in addition to what's already happening, we need folks like yourselves to help us really uplift what are the solutions at hand, and the fact that farm workers are they're the best enforcement mechanism that can protect them in very isolated areas that are often overlooked.
Exactly. And what I'm thinking right now, and I know a lot of folks are thinking, is what are the policies that are actively hurting people? And this really starts to think, in my head, I start to think about what's happening in Florida. How are migrants being impacted by the anti-immigrant policy that was just placed in Florida? And what are y'all doing to try to support some of the farm workers there?
Where fear has been exacerbated, right? Like we saw that in the past in Arizona. We've seen it as draconian, awful laws that are meant to create fear, not just amongst farm workers, but amongst residents of that state. We understand that farm workers, who've been reaching out to us, who ask questions, who are on social media, who are posting. We have organizers in South Georgia who work both in Florida and in Georgia, who've made decisions to stay in certain states to try to avoid going to Florida. The issue here is that we need to ensure that farm workers understand what their rights are. But that we're also highlighting the irony of it all, right? That these are employers play a huge role in ensuring that they also are voicing the need for workers and the need to protect immigrant workers who make up the vast majority of agribusiness and agricultural industry. And so they play a role. But when you see that, these are individuals or associations that are often pushing for policies to take rights away from farm workers, and then are also supporting candidates who are anti-immigrant. It just doesn't make any sense. And so I do know that farm workers have been very resilient over the years. And the fact is that there are many organizations on the ground also in Florida who are doing work directly with farm workers. Right now around the country, we during the pandemic were advocating very heavily to ensure that disaster relief related to the pandemic was provided to farm workers around the country. And so the Biden administration allocated close to $700 million in disaster relief related to the pandemic to farm and food workers, mainly like meat packing workers and farm workers. And so right now we're implementing this program as one of the organizations that received a grant from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And so we've been working with farm workers in all 50 states and in 3 territories, set up a call center where farm workers are able to call in, and we're able to help them apply for the $600 in disaster relief. And so that also gives us an opportunity to talk with farm workers from different parts of the country, including Florida, and provide them like, hey, this is an organization you can reach out to, or organizations that we work with as well, who you can be connected to so you don't feel alone, so you know where to go if you run into any issues with ICE or any other agency that is targeting you.
Right. Thank you so much, Deanna. And just to close off, because I know you are an extremely busy person, continuously fighting for the most vulnerable in our community. Oftentimes we hear that, when we're thinking about the migrant workers in history, well, Cesar Chavez did everything. We're done. We're done. Cesar Chavez got us protection and we're done. Nothing else. We don't need to address anything else. How do you respond to that? And how do we continue to our advocacy for a lot of our farm workers who bring food to our table? And a lot of us coming into especially for Jews, our high holidays coming into our new year, are thinking about our fresh fruit and what new fruit we're going to bring to our table.
Well, Caesar's legacy continues, right? He and Dolores Huertan and other wonderful champions, the farm workers, really fought to get this farm worker movement started. And it is a continuous journey and cause, because regardless, in the US, the agricultural industry has continued this culture of exploitation and exclusion. And so, as we continue to make more progress, because we are winning some contracts in New York, we're doing organizing work through the union. Here in California, we're winning new laws at state levels, pushing for more enforcement. But I can't stress enough how important consumer pressure is. And so, I really believe that the more that consumers do to ensure that retailers are understanding, like if you're shopping at Whole Foods, if you're shopping at Costco, wherever it is, that they understand also like what it is that consumers care about. And so being very vocal about expectations is important. And then just staying connected with us, the UFW, UFW.org, and the UFW Foundation. We're constantly raising funds to try to ensure that we are on the ground or digitally connecting to workers, that we're doing the advocacy work that's needed, taking farm workers to Washington, D.C. or to state capitals, making those connections with families to ensure that they understand that being vocal is important. And so I would just encourage folks to just stay connected with this cause, that this continues to be work that's needed, and that you are a very important element of making progress in agriculture, ensuring that those who feed this nation are able to feed their own families.
Deeply appreciate you and all of UFW's foundation's work and UFW across. Thank you so much for continuing to fight for the most vulnerable in our community. We look to continue to partner with you all in raising awareness and advocacy for our farm workers nationwide. Diana, Torres, thank you so much. I hope you have an amazing day. And I appreciate everybody watching here. I encourage you all to take a look at UFW Foundation's work. Make sure you follow them on social media and stay up to date with their amazing work. Thank you so much, everybody. Shana tova. Bye-bye.